Remember, education is knowledge, and knowledge is power.
You know, it's just one four-letter word, but wow, does it have the power to start a fight? Or in this case, a whole federal lawsuit. So when that word gets plastered on a flag and aimed at a president, does the First Amendment actually protect it? We're about to dive into a fascinating legal battle that really pushes the limits of what we can and can't say in public. So here's how we're going to break this down. First, we'll look at the incident in Florida that started this whole thing. Then we're going to jump back in time to a 50-year-old case that, believe it or not, sets all the rules. After that, we'll see how the judge made his call. And finally, we'll talk about why this case really matters to all of us. All right, let's set the scene. We're on a public sidewalk in Punta Gorda, Florida. This is where a couple of flags and the words on them ended up sparking a huge constitutional debate. And yeah, these were the exact words on display. The flags were, you might say, equal opportunity offenders. They went after political figures on both sides. And it was this specific raw language that kicked off the entire legal showdown. And this right here, this is the million-dollar question, isn't it? Is this a form of protected political speech, or does it cross some kind of line into being illegal? That's exactly what the courts had to figure out. So let's get into the specifics of what actually went down. Back in 2021, a guy named Andrew Sheets is just standing there with his flags and a t-shirt that had a, let's say, similar vibe. An officer, David Lipker, comes up and gives him a citation. But here's the key. He didn't cite him for disturbing the peace. He cited him specifically because he said the language was obscene. And that one word, obscene, is going to become incredibly important. Okay, so to really understand what happened in Florida, we actually have to jump in a time machine and go back more than 50 years. There was a huge Supreme Court case way back in 1971 that laid the legal groundwork for literally everything that happened with Andrew Sheets' flags. And this just shows you exactly how the legal system works, right? A decision from decades ago about a guy wearing a jacket that said "fuck the draft," by the way, created this really clear legal standard. And that same standard was pulled right off the shelf and applied by a federal judge in 2024 to this flag incident in Florida. This is the most famous line from that 1971 ruling. And it just gets right to the heart of it. The Supreme Court basically said that the government can't be the politeness patrol. It doesn't get to ban words just because some people might find them offensive, especially when those words are being used to get a political point across. Okay, so this slide is absolutely crucial. Remember how the officer cited Sheets for obscenity? Well, legally, that word has a very specific, very high bar. Obscenity is not protected speech, but it almost always has to involve sexual content that violates community standards. The F word, when you're using it to yell about politics, isn't obscenity. The law calls it profanity, and profanity, when it's part of political speech, is very, very often protected. So with all that history in mind, let's jump back to the present day and see how the judge handled this. The whole case ended up hinging on a really big legal idea called qualified immunity. So what is qualified immunity? Well, think of it like a legal shield. It protects police officers and other government officials from getting sued. But, and this is a huge but, that shield disappears if they violate a constitutional right that is clearly established. This whole concept is at the center of a massive debate in America, and this case is a perfect example of why. So the big question for the judge was pretty simple. Was the right to fly these flags a clearly established right, or was the law kind of murky, maybe giving the officer a pass for making a reasonable mistake? And the judge's answer could not have been more clear. He said, absolutely not. The officer was not protected by qualified immunity. That shield was gone. So why did he say no? Well, the judge laid it out. First, he said this law isn't some new, confusing thing. It's been clearly established for over half a century because of that 1971 case. Second, the officer wasn't just enforcing a clear rule, he was making what the judge called a subjective judgment call. And finally, the judge hammered the point home. Vulgar political speech is just not the same thing as illegal obscenity. The officer, he said, got the law wrong, plain and simple. Okay, so an officer in Florida lost his immunity defense. That's a big deal for him, for sure. But why should anyone outside of that town care? Well, because a ruling like this has ripple effects for free speech everywhere, especially in the world we live in today. Let's look at the immediate fallout. First, because that immunity shield is gone, Andrew Sheets' lawsuit against the officer can now go forward. But check this out.
The city of Punta Gorda got so spooked by this ruling that it went and completely deleted the ordinance the officer used from its law books. It's just gone. That tells you everything you need to know.
So if you only take one thing away from all this, let it be this. This case is a huge reminder that the First Amendment isn't there to protect polite, agreeable speech. It's specifically there to protect the passionate, the critical, and yeah, sometimes even the offensive stuff. And this really gets to the bigger picture, you know? It's that classic slippery slope argument. If we let the government start censoring words just because they're offensive, what's to stop them from censoring an idea they find offensive? Or a protest? Or a whole political movement? Protecting the stuff on the fringes is what keeps the whole thing safe. So while this case gives us a pretty clear answer based on a 50-year-old rule, the tension underneath it all, that never really goes away. And it leaves us with this fundamental question that we all have to wrestle with. How do we protect our vital right to express ourselves while also keeping things from descending into chaos? This ruling drew a line in the sand, but you can bet the debate will continue.
Have you heard the word? thepolicerecord.com/invite/LJLP. Get you some discountage over there at thepolicerecord.com. Hope to see you there.